The rifle was wrong. That was her first coherent thought. Not the barbed wire, not the dust-choked air.
Of the compound, not even the surrender itself, but the rifle cradled casually in the arms of a woman
who looked barely older than herself. The weapon rested against a uniform identical to those worn by the male guards.
The fabric creased and worn from use, not costume. The woman's hair was pinned beneath a cap,
marked with the same insignia as the men. Her boots, scuffed and practical, carried the same mud.
And when she turned to speak to a male soldier standing beside her, he straightened slightly, nodded, and obeyed.
The young Japanese nurse felt the world tilt. She had been prepared for cruelty. She had been prepared for humiliation.
or starvation, for the leering triumph of male victors. She had not been prepared for this. A woman with authority.
A woman with a weapon. A woman whose voice carried command. And men, American men, who listened without question, without resentment.
Without the faintest suggestion that her orders were anything but legitimate. It was as though someone had rewritten the fundamental laws
Of nature while she wasn't looking. Around her, other captured women whispered in sharp, disbelieving tones.
One pointed with trembling fingers. Another covered her mouth as though witnessing something obscene. The impossible had manifested before them.
Not as rumor or propaganda, but as flesh and blood reality. American women in uniform. Soldiers. Not nurses relegated to bandages. Bedpans, but women who carried the same responsibilities, the same ranks, the same unquestioned presence as men. The cognitive dissonance
was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment the nurse wondered if she had died after all, if this was some fever dream.
Cruel nor kind, simply professional. She asked a question in English, her tone firm but not harsh. When no one answered, she gestured.
Toward the barracks with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The Japanese women shuffled forward, their eyes never leaving
her, as though afraid that if they blinked, the vision might dissolve. This was not captivity as they had imagined it. This was something
far stranger, far more destabilizing. This was a glimpse into a world where everything they had been taught about women, about power,
about the natural order itself, was simply wrong. She had been raised in a country where a woman's place
was as clearly defined as the borders on a map. From the moment of her first memory, the rules had been absolute, woven into
Every meal, every lesson, every glance exchanged between adults. Women bowed lower. Women spoke
brothers, sons, and above all, the nation itself. To question this was not merely rebellion, it was incoherence, like questioning whether the
sun would rise. Her childhood had been a careful choreography of submission. At meals, the men ate first, selecting the best portions while women waited, often finishing whatever scraps remained. Her father never struck her, but his silences carried the weight of commandments. When she excelled in mathematics, solving problems that baffled her brothers, he praised her diligence, then gently reminded her that such skills would help her manage a household budget someday. The door to anything beyond domesticity was not locked, it simply did not exist in the architecture of her world.
School reinforced what home had taught. While boys studied engineering and philosophy, girls learned sewing, etiquette, and the art of appearing.
Smaller than they were. She remembered a teacher, a woman herself, explaining with patient firmness,
as though imparting profound wisdom. It flows where it is meant to go. The nurse had written the words dutifully in her notebook, to mold herself to the needs of others. A river does not fight the shape of its banks, the teacher had said, smiling.
Even as something deep inside her recoiled. When the war came.
as a nurse, not because the role called to her, but because it was the only way a young woman could contribute without
Violating propriety. Nursing was acceptable. It was maternal, nurturing, an extension of a woman's natural role as...
But the hierarchy remained untouched. Male doctors commanded. Male officers decided.
Acceptable. She had watched male medics bark orders at her with less training and half her skill, simply because their gender granted them.
Authority her competence could not. Once, she had suggested a different treatment for a soldier with a gangrenous wound, a technique she had read about.
In a medical journal, The doctor had stared at her with such profound confusion that she felt her cheeks burn.
He did. Not yell. He simply resumed his work as though she had not spoken, as though her words had been the buzzing of an insect. Audible, perhaps, but beneath the threshold of meaningful communication. The other nurses accepted this without complaint, or if they felt otherwise, they buried it so deeply
That even they could not excavate it. To be a woman in wartime Japan was to be a ghost in your own.
Life, present but insubstantial, necessary but unacknowledged. They worked 20-hour shifts.
That their suffering was the least they could offer. Men died in glorious battle. Women died in silent endurance. Both were forms of service. But only one earned statues. The Bushido Code, ancient and uncompromising, had filled
The entire nation. Honor was everything. Shame was death. And for women, honor.
Her body was not her own, but a vessel for the nation's future. Her mind, her ambitions, her dreams.
For him was transcendence. To surrender was unthinkable. She remembered the oath.
They had been told that capture by the enemy meant horrors beyond imagination. American soldiers, they were warned,
And discard them like broken tools. Better to take one's own life than endure such degradation. Better to die with honor intact.
Than live as a ruined thing. Repeated the words. She had repeated.
Them absolutely. But belief is a fragile thing when tested against reality. When her unit was overrun,
When she found herself surrounded by American soldiers, she had braced for the horrors she'd been promised. She had expected violence, expected
cruelty, expected the confirmation of everything she had been taught about the enemy's savagery. What she had not expected, what no amount of training or propaganda
could have prepared her for, was gentleness. A canteen of water offered without demand for gratitude.
Hands. Food that was warm, abundant, and given freely. And then, the woman. The soldier.
At the American woman who patrolled the perimeter with the same easy authority as her male counterparts. The nurse's mind scrambled to reconcile what she saw with
Everything she knew to be true. Women did not carry weapons. Women did not give orders. Women did not stand as equals among men. These
were facts as immutable as gravity. Yet here, gravity had reversed, and she was left floating.
Like drowning! Other Japanese prisoners gathered in small clusters, their whispers urgent and frightened.
dressed in uniform to humiliate them. Another argued they must be prisoners themselves, forced into service as some grotesque punishment. But the nurse watched. The way the American men deferred to the women. The way conversations flowed without the rigid hierarchy she had known all her life. And she
understood with cold clarity that this was no trick. This was simply how their world worked. That realization was more terrifying than any torture could have been.
Because if this was real, if women could be soldiers, if they could command and be obeyed, if they could exist as full human beings,
rather than shadows of men, then what did that say about her entire life? What did it say about the sacrifices she
had made, the dreams she had buried, the voice she had silenced until she could barely hear it herself? She thought of her mother, who had never once sat at the table until every man had finished eating. She thought of her aunts, who bowed so deeply their
Foreheads nearly touched the floor when greeting male relatives. She thought of herself, accepting a doctor's dismissal.
It was a betrayal of her very nature as a woman. And now, standing in this dusty compound, watching
A male private said before correcting his stance with brisk professionalism. The nurse felt something crack inside her.
Hairline fracture, thin and sharp, that would only widen with time. She did not yet know the word for what she was.
donned uniforms, that they served in roles from clerical to intelligence to flight training, that they were not anomalies, but evidence of an entirely
different civilization.
Conditioning.
Of captivity. It would reshape not only her understanding of the war, but of herself, of
barbed wire. She did not yet know that this moment, standing frozen, watching an American woman soldier adjust her rifle with practiced ease,
would become the pivot point of her entire life. She only knew that something fundamental had broken.
The woman with the rifle glanced her way, their eyes meeting for just a moment. The American nodded, a simple acknowledgement of shared humanity.
Then continued her patrol. That nod, casual and unremarkable to the one who gave it, landed
Seen, not as a servant, not as a prisoner, not as a woman who existed only in relation to men, but as a person, an equal.
And once you have been seen that way, even once, you can never fully accept invisibility again.
on her collar. The nurse noticed them immediately, her mind cataloging details with the precision her medical training had instilled.
Despite the dust of the camp, a clipboard tucked under one arm and a pistol holstered at her hip. Not decorative, not borrowed, but worn with the
casual familiarity of someone who had carried it for years. The woman moved through the compound with purposeful strides, her boots striking the ground with
the same confident rhythm as any male officer the nurse had ever seen. What unsettled her most was not the uniform or the weapon, but the reactions of the men around her. When the lieutenant approached a group of male soldiers, they straightened instinctively.
The kind of deference the nurse had only ever witnessed directed at men of rank. The lieutenant spoke, her voice clear, not shrill or apologetic.
But matter of fact, and the soldiers dispersed to follow her instructions without hesitation, without the faintest flicker of resentment or condescension. The nurse stood near
the medical tent, ostensibly waiting for her wound to be redressed, but in truth she could not look away. She watched the lieutenant consult with a male
Captain, the two leaning over a map spread across a makeshift table. They debated something, their tones professional, neither yielding simply because of gender. When they
reached a decision, the captain nodded and moved off to implement it. The woman remained, making notations on her clipboard, absorbed in her work with
the ease of someone who had never been told her presence required permission. Another Japanese prisoner sidled close.
Call her, please. The nurse shook her head slowly, uncertain. I don't know. They seemed equal. That cannot be.
darker. Fear, perhaps, or the vertigo of watching one's entire worldview dissolve. Women do not command.
This is why they lost their morality. But even as the words left her mouth, both women continued to stare.
Trained to render, the reality before them refused to cooperate. These American women were not suffering. They were not shamed. They were not hidden away like
embarrassments. They simply existed, occupying space and authority as though it had always been theirs. The medical tent became a laboratory of impossible sights.
The nurse returned the following day to have her bandage changed, and this time the person who greeted her was not a male medic, but a woman.
In a crisp white uniform bearing the insignia of the Army Nurse Corps. She was older, perhaps 35, with lines around her eyes.
That suggested year of squinting at surgical sites and patient charts. Her hands moved with clinical precision.
But thorough pressure. Healing well, the woman said in English, though the nurse understood nothing but the toe, approving, professional.
Antiseptic, her touch neither rough nor excessively gentle, simply competent. She applied fresh gauze and wound the bandage with a kind of efficient expertise that spoke.
to thousands of repetitions. When she finished, she patted the nurse's shoulder lightly and smiled, not with pity, but with the camaraderie of
one medical professional to another. The gesture stunned her. In Japan, even among nurses,
Corrected, and occasionally praised from a distance. But this American woman, despite being older and clearly more experienced,
had never received from a peer respect untainted by rank. Through the tent's open flap, she watched another American
of the Women's Army Corps stride past carrying a radio pack on her back. The equipment looked heavy, the kind of load the nurse had only ever
seen men transport. Yet this woman moved with brisk efficiency, adjusting the straps as she walked, pausing to speak into the hands.
A male soldier jogged up beside her, gesturing to the radio. She shook her head, said something brief, and he nodded, falling back.
She had refused him. A woman had refused a man's offer of help, and he had accepted it without offense.
piling up faster than she could process them, each one a small explosion in the carefully constructed understanding of how the world worked. Women carrying heavy equipment. Women making medical decisions. Women wearing rank that men respected. women speaking with authority that went on.
Pass through Earth, yet undeniably happening.
One by one into a tent where their basic information would be recorded. The nurse expected a male officer, perhaps with a translator. Instead,
She found herself seated across from a woman in a Navy uniform, a WAVE, though she did not yet know the term, whose collar bore the insignia of an ensign. The woman's dark hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, studied the nurse with the assessing gaze of someone trained in intelligence work.
A male translator sat to the side, but it was the woman who asked the questions.
Name? Name? The translator repeated in Japanese. The nurse answered, her voice small. Age? Again, she responded.
Slightly, not threateningly, but with the posture of someone accustomed to extracting information. We're not here to hurt you, the translator conveyed. We need basic
information for processing.
Your cooperation will make things easier for everyone.
The word cooperation landed strangely.
A concept so foreign in military context that the nurse almost laughed. Instead, she answered the questions mechanically.
Precise handwriting, her fountain pen moving across the page with practiced strokes. When the interrogation concluded, the woman stood, and the translator stood with her, but a
Beat slower, as though he had to remember to do so. The deference was subtle but unmistakable. This woman outranked him, or at minimum,
Held equivalent status. She thanked the nurse in English, the translator echoing the sentiment, and gestured toward the door. As the nurse rose to leave, she risked a...
What is your rank?
ensign, naval intelligence.
But you are a woman.
And the American's smile widened, though not mockingly. She said something, and the translator chuckled before conveying,
Still a woman. And also, still an officer. The nurse left the tent in a daze.
Womanhood and rank was so unremarkable it barely warranted comment. But for the nurse, it was an earthquake. Would have been humiliated to be interrogated by a female officer, because such a position was unthinkable. Yet here, it was simply normal.
The truck depot became another theater of revelation. Assigned to work detail, voluntary, the guards stressed.
Sorting supplies near a row of military vehicles. And there, behind the wheel of massive cargo truck, sat an American woman in OAC uniform.
She was broad-shouldered, her sleeves rolled to reveal tanned, muscular forearms, and she drove the vehicle with the easy confidence of someone who had logged
Thousands of my miles. The nurse watched, transfixed as the woman backed the truck into a tight loading space. Soldiers on how to load the cargo. Careful with those crates, she called out, her voice carrying across the depot. Medical supplies. If you break them, you'll answer to the surgeon, not me, and trust me, you don't want that. The men grinned and obeyed. There was no resentment, no.
Muttering behind her back, only the easy banter of colleagues who had worked together long enough to develop rhythm. One soldier made a joke, and the woman laughed.
a full-throated sound that echoed across the compound. Then she climbed back into the truck, gunned the engine, and drove off in a cloud of
dust, leaving the Japanese women staring after her. She drives, one prisoner whispered, as though witness trembling. She laughs, a third said, and this observation hung heaviest of all. Was to draw attention, to take up space in a way that violated the fundamental rule of femininity. Be small, be quiet, disappear when not. Needed, but this American woman had laughed without apology, and the world had not ended. The men had not recoiled in disgust. The social order had not collapsed. She had simply laughed, driven away, and continued existing as a full person. In the
Japanese women ate their meals provided tables.
Not on their own food. It was on the American personnel dining nearby. Male and female soldiers sat together, not segregated by gender. They passed salt.
Shared jokes, debated baseball scores with animated gestures.
The nurse watched a whack corporal lean back in her cigarette while arguing good-naturedly with a male sergeant about something the nurse couldn't understand. The man laughed, conceded a point, then countered with his own argument.
The woman shook her head, grinning, and took another drag from her cigarette. No one told her to sit properly. No one suggested her posture was. No one implied that her presence among men, her casual demeanor, her confidence, was anything other than
startling. 2 American women, one a lieutenant, one a captain, walked past a group of male enlisted men. The men stopped their conversation mid-sentence, straightened, and
saluted.
The officers returned the salutes crisply and continued on their way, deep in conversation. The male soldiers resumed talking, the interaction so routine it barely
registered. But for the Japanese women watching, it registered like thunder. Men saluting women.
The structure that placed competence and position above gender.
Everything she thought she understood. The nurse found herself seeking out these encounters, hungry for more pieces of the puzzle, even as each piece
unsettled her further. She watched an American woman pilot, yes, a pilot, in leather jacket and flight goggles, joke with clerks managing complex logistics, their desks piled with paperwork, their decisions affecting hundreds of personnel.
Decorative additions or token gestures, but as integral components of a functioning military machine. One afternoon, she witnessed a moment that would replay in her memory.
For decades.
For decades. A male officer made a mistake in requisitioning supplies, and a female warrant officer, older, gray-haired, out. Not gently, not deferentially, but with the sharp professionalism of someone who would not tolerate incompetence regardless of who committed it.
Form is filled out incorrectly. You've requested the wrong caliber ammunition for those weapons. If this goes through, we'll have useless supplies and a
unit that can't defend itself. The male officer's face reddened, but he looked at the form, nodded curtly, and said, "You're right, I'll correct it. Thank you."
You, Chief! The woman nodded, handed the form back, and walked away. No drama, no humiliation.
Inside her chest, not her heart, but something deeper. Something she had buried so thoroughly she had forgotten.
This stirring. It felt like betrayal and liberation tangled together, impossible to separate. And replayed everything she had seen. Women with weapons, women with rank, women laughing,
Pattern. This was not aberration. This was structure. This was an entire military, an entire nation that had been forming since that first sight of a woman with a rifle finally crystallized into words. If they can be this, why?
Carefully. The question was heretical. It was dangerous.
Distance. But once asked, it could not be unasked. Once seen, it could not be unseen. The propaganda had told them American women were
corrupted, morally bankrupt, suffering under a system that destroyed their femininity. But these women were
vital, more present, more human than many of the women the nurse had known in Japan, who had moved through life.
The propaganda had lied. Or perhaps more accurately, it had told a truth so partial but that violation had not destroyed them. It had not made them less. It had made them more. That realization alone was enough to
keep her awake for hours, turning it over and over, examining it from every angle like a strange artifact from an alien world. Which, in a sense,
it was. But as the days passed and she came to observe other dimensions of this alien civilization,
uniformly masculine in their presentation. Some wore makeup when off duty. Some styled their hair within the bounds of regular
sweethearts and families. But they also swore, lifted Healy equipment, made crude jokes, and demonstrated a physical...
What struck the Japanese nurse most was not that these women had abandoned femininity, but that they had somehow expanded its definition. They were feminine and competent, soft.
Strong, nurturing, and authoritative, beautiful and capable all at once, not sacrificing one for the other, but somehow holding all these qualities.
Simultaneously. In Japan, she had been taught that such combinations were impossible, that to be capable meant ceasing to...
These American women disproved that lie simply by existing. One evening, the nurse struck up a hesitant conversation. Osaka, who had been conscripted into nursing. They were washing clothes in the communal area, a task that provided cover for careful talk. Do you see? Them? The nurse asked quietly, her hands working a shirt against the washboard. The American women? Else was listening. I see them. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. And I cannot reconcile what I see with what
I was taught.
The nurse felt a rush of relief so profound she nearly wept.
I thought I was the only one. No, the teacher.
There are others. Not many dare speak of it, but I've seen it in their faces. The confusion, the questioning. We were told these women
would be miserable, that their society would be chaos, that rejecting proper feminine roles would destroy them. But they are not destroyed. They are thriving.
Silence stretched between them.
filled with the sound of scrubbing and the distant calls of guards.
Does it mean that we were lied to, obviously? But deeper than that, what does it mean about us?
But she knew the question would haunt her. If Japanese women could be like America,
had spent making herself small, every dream she had swallowed, every opinion she had silenced, was not a necessary sacrifice, but a
tragedy. The rage that thought produced was immediate and scalding. She scrubbed harder at the shirt.
It could overwhelm her. Rage at whom? At the military leaders who had conscripted her? At the society that had shaped her into someone who believed her own diminishment was virtue? At her parents who had raised her to seek approval rather than achievement? At herself for accepting it all? The rage had no clear target, which made it more dangerous, more destabilizing. It threatened to corrode the
else, something she could barely acknowledge but could no longer deny. Hope. Dangerous, seditious, impossible.
Too. Perhaps not now. Perhaps not in this world ruled by defeated Japan's conquerors.
Not all the prisoners felt this awakening. Many retreated further into the old certainties, finding safety in familiar beliefs.
Been most deeply invested in traditional roles. Those who had built their identities entirely around service to men reacted with horror. They called the American women false power. Unnecessary. That every compromise, every silenced ambition, every moment of self-erasure had been a choice.
To condemn the Americans than to question the entire architecture of one's own life. But for others, including the nurse, there was no.
Be forgotten. The camp became a site of quiet radicalization, though none of the prisoners would have used such a word. They did not think
of themselves as radicals or feminists, terms they did not know. They simply thought of themselves as people who had seen something.
Could not unsee it. One day, about 3 weeks into captivity, the nurse witnessed an interaction that crystallized everything. An American woman sergeant was training a group
of male soldiers on proper radio protocol.
The men, some clearly older than her, stood at attention while at one point a private, perhaps 22, fumbled with a frequency dial. The sergeant stepped forward, not harshly, but with a firm.
Patience of a competent instructor, like this. See how the indicator lines up? You need to feel the click, not force it. The private nodded, tried again. And succeed.
Good.
Now remember that for the field. Your life might depend on it.
Yes, Sergeant.
The exchange was utterly mundane.
That was.
What made it profound? This was not a special circumstance or an emergency exception. This was Tuesday. This was normal. A woman...
That teaching. The structure holding, the world continuing to turn. The nurse felt tears, and rage and hope tangled together, all the more powerful for being unnamed. That night, unable to
in Japan, she knew the letter would be censored, read by American authorities before it was sent, so she chose her words.
Carefully. Dear sister, I am well. The Americans treat us fairly.
You. She paused, pen hovering over the paper. How to convey what different from what we were told. She crossed that out. Too direct. She tried again.
Own lives differently. Better, but still too revealing. Finally, she settled on something that felt both true and safe.
Perspectives. I look forward to discussing them with you in person while I return. It was bland, innocuous, and entirely inadequate to capture the revolution happening
inside her. But it would have to do. She signed it, folded it carefully, and placed it in the box designated for
outgoing mail. The next morning brought news that would reshape the trajectory of the prisoners' captivity.
The war was over! A translator. The words falling into the assembled prisoners like stones into water, each creating expanding ring.
Frozen, as though the words had not yet achieved meaning. Still others showed expressions of profound
a physical weight. The nurse felt all these emotions simultaneously, and none of them fully.
Defeated, but stronger than either was something else. Something she had not anticipated. Nothing, who would slip back into their old lives as though this interlude had never happened. She grieved for the women who had.
Seen what she had seen and would spend the rest of their lives trying to unsee it, to force themselves back into shapes that no longer fit.
And most of all, she grieved for herself, because she knew with absolute certainty that she could not go altered, and the Japan she would return to was the same one that had taught her to be invisible. The teacher found her that afternoon.
The war is over.
Yes.
We can.
Go home. Another long silence. Then the teacher spoke, her voice very quiet.
Agreed. We are not. What will we do? I don't know, the teacher said. But I know I cannot pretend I didn't see.
What I saw. Me neither, said the nurse. And somehow in that admission there was a strange comfort. Who had seen and could not unsee. In the days before repatriation, these women talked in quiet. Their observations were political or radical. Some simply marveled at small details. Did you... Apologizing for it. Another recalled the pilot, her confidence when discussing engines. Wanted to understand how things worked. My father said it was unsuitable, so I stopped. The simple confession hung in the air, its implications. Devastating. How many interests had been declared unsuitable? How many passions had been gently but firmly redirected?
The losses. Each woman offering her own story of curiosity curtailed, of ambition redirected, of...
Not a nurse. A doctor. My examination scores were excellent. But my father said medical... Right, another admitted. Stories, maybe even for newspapers. But girls who wanted to write were...
To not marry at all, a third said, very quietly, as though the admission might still carry consequences.
But that was unthinkable. Selfish. A woman who didn't want marriage and children was refusing her duty.
The collective reckoning. These were not isolated incidents of individual women being told no. This was systematic.
In Imperial Japan.
The nurse listened to each story, and with each one, the anger inside her burned hotter.
Potential of every woman around her. This was not personal failure. This was institutional theft. On this...
Of other women, waiting to board the ship that would carry them home. Home. The word felt strange.
Bundle of belongings and tried to imagine what awaited her. A defeated nation. A collapsed empire.
In the wake of shame, how did you challenge a system when that system was all you had left of national pride? But then she looked around.
At the women near her in line. The teacher was 3 people ahead, meeting her eyes with a small nod. Others from their informal group were scattered throughout the line, each carrying the same knowledge, the same impossible question. She was not alone.
Perhaps was enough. Not to change everything immediately, but to plant seeds that might, someday.
Ship came into view, the nurse thought about those American women one last time. She did not know their names. She had never spoken to
most of them. But they had taught her something more fundamental than any lesson learned in a classroom or from a commanding officer. They
had taught her by simply existing, by living lives that proved the lie of everything she had been told about what women were and could be.
She would carry that knowledge home with her, hidden but unshakable. A quiet revolution that had already...
Horns sounded, a deep, mournful note that echoed across the harbor. Women began fighting.
Had left behind, but also toward lives that could never quite be the same. The nurse paused at the top of the gangway, turning for one.
Last look at the compound. In the distance, she could see American personnel going about their routines. A woman in a WAC uniform directing a last look at the compound. In the distance, she could see American personnel going about their routines. A woman in a WAC uniform directing a
truck. 2 nurses conferring over a patient chart. A female officer reviewing troops. All of it continuing, normal and unremarkable. A world that
would persist whether she watched it or not. That persistence was perhaps the most powerful lesson of all.
Once seen, could not be denied. She turned away from the compound and walked onto the ship, joining the hundreds of other women crowded.
On the deck. The smell of sea salt and rust, the press of bodies, the low murmur of voices. Women were crying, overcome with relief or shame or exhaustion.
Watched the shore recede. The teacher appeared beside her, wordless, and they stood together as the ship began to move. Engines.
Their feet. The compound grew smaller, then smaller still, until it was just a dark smudge on the horizon.
Of the enemy, the place of captivity faded from view. But what she had learned there would remain indelible. A long silence. The nurse considered the question. It was not rhetorical. A long silence. The nurse considered the question. It was not rhetorical.
Don't know, she admitted. But I know I can't pretend. I can't go back to who I was. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't. That version of me is gone. Good, the teacher said firmly. She should be gone. She was never real anyway, just a performance we were.
Trained to give so well, we forgot we were performing. The nurse nodded slowly. The ship.
Their feet. The compound grew smaller, then smaller still, until it was just a dark smudge on the horizon.
Of the enemy, the place of captivity faded from view. But what she had learned there would remain indelible. A long silence. The nurse considered the question. It was not rhetorical.
Don't know, she admitted. But I know I can't pretend. I can't go back to who I was. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't. That version of me is gone. Good, the teacher said firmly. She should be gone. She was never real anyway, just a performance we were.
Trained to give so well, we forgot we were performing. The nurse nodded slowly. The ship.
Future. Days passed.
Were returning to. The small group of awakened women found each other naturally, gravitating to the same section of deck.
Their shared experience created a bond that needed no constant articulation. One evening,
To Molten Gold, one of the women, a former factory worker, spoke. My daughter is 5 years old. I haven't seen her since.
She was 3. She paused, her throat working. What do I tell her about what women can be? Do I tell her what I saw? Or
do I raise her the way I was raised, teaching her to be small and quiet and grateful for whatever crumbs men offer her?
Silence fell over the group, heavy with the weight of the question. Finally, the teacher spoke. You tell her the truth. You tell
her what you saw, and you tell her that she can be more than what Japan tells her she can be. Even if it's dangerous.
Even if she suffers for it. Because the alternative is raising another generation of women who live half-lives, who die without ever knowing what they could have been. The factory worker nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. Speaking. It will be hard, but it's harder to live a lie. And maybe, if enough of us tell the truth to sisters, our students, maybe things will change. Not in our lifetime, perhaps. Planning nothing concrete, organizing no movement, articulating no manifesto. They were simply women who had seen.
Unsee it. That refusal, quiet and unorganized as it was, would prove to be a form of resistance more durable than any formal movement.
10th day, someone called out.
Land!
The word rippled through the crowded deck. Women rushed to the railing, craning to see the first.
Dark outline of Japan emerging from the morning mist. The nurse stood back, letting others crowd forward.
Grew clearer as they approached. Hills scarred by war, buildings reduced to rubble. A nation that had been...
That would need to rebuild, and in that rebuilding, perhaps there would be space for new ways of being, new possibilities. Or perhaps the defeat.
It would make people cling more tightly to tradition, to the old hierarchies that at least felt familiar. She didn't know. No one knew.
The ship docked in a harbor filled with vessels like theirs, all disgorging the human debris of war. soldier galaxies, into a homeland that had little capacity to receive them. The processing took hours, names checked against lists.
Existed. Assignments to temporary housing for those with nowhere to go.
She had no way of knowing if the house still stood, or if her parents had survived the war. The officials waved her through with barely
a glance, and she found herself standing on Japanese soil for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, though it had been only months.
The city was unrecognizable, where buildings had stood, rubble, where streets had bustled.
Everywhere, people who moved with the exhaustion of those who had given everything and lost. She no longer existed. Finally, after walking for what felt like miles, she turned a corner and stopped. One wall scorched black, part of the roof collapsed, but standing. Slid open and her mother appeared, older, thinner, her face etched with new lines. Face crumpled and she rushed forward, pulling her daughter into an embrace that spoke of months of not knowing.
Mother sobbed. "You're alive! Thank the gods you're alive!" The nurse held her mother and felt the thinness of her body, the fragility
that years of war and privation had created. This was what survival looked like. Inside, the house was sparse. Much of the furniture had been sold
or burned for fuel. The few possessions that remained were carefully maintained.
Appeared from the back room, moving slowly, his back bent with more than age. When he saw her, his face showed relief mixed with something
darker. Shame, perhaps, at the nation's defeat, at his inability to pretend it as
throat working.
Welcome home.
The first days were strange, a dance of adjustment and unspoken.
Though the subject were too painful or shameful to address directly, they spoke of practical matters, food rationing, repairs needed to the house.
The challenges of finding work in a devastated economy.
But beneath the mundane conversation, the nurse felt the weight of things unsaid. Her father's shame at
defeat. Her mother's quiet grief for the sons of neighbors who would never return. And her own...
Make it impossible to simply slip back into her old life. She tried. For the first weeks, she played the part of the dutiful daughter.
Returned. She helped her mother with household tasks. She spoke quietly and kept her eyes downcast. She did not contradict her father, even when he said
things she knew were false. But each act of like swallowing glass.
The sergeant training men, and she would feel the gap between those memories and her current reality like a physical wound. The breaking point came on.
An ordinary evening. Her father was speaking about the occupation, about American forces in Japan.
アメリカ人には文化も繁華もないな。優しいんだな。特の女たちはね、卒業になっていた間に見たかな。歩き回っている様をな。
Men carrying weapons, giving orders, shameless!
No Japanese woman would debase herself so. Dignity. The nurse felt something inside her snap. For weeks, she had swallowed her...
Her father condemned the very women who had
shown her another way of being was too much. That's not true, she said quietly.
The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Her father stopped mid-sentence.
A foreign tongue.
What did you say?
The American women I saw, the nurse continued, her voice still quiet but growing steadier with each
word. They were not shameless. They were not debased. They were soldiers, officers, professionals. They were capable and competent.
You will not speak to me that way.
I will speak the truth, Father. Powerful surge through her chest. Even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if it challenges what you want to believe about the world, the truth is that women can be more than what we have been told. I saw it. I lived among them. They are not unhappy or suffering.
If anything, they seemed more fully human than many women I have known here.
You have been poisoned by them. You speak of our women as though they are somehow less. We have a culture thousands of years.
Old.
Yes, Father, the nurse said, standing now too, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in her life. A culture that tells half its population that their worth lie in silence and service. A culture that wastes the potential of women by demanding they remain small. That is the culture you are so proud of.
Silence crashed down like a physical force.
Trembling, his hands clenched into fists. For a terrible moment, she thought he might strike her. Then he turned and walked out of
The room, his footsteps heavy on the floor. Her mother rushed to her, grabbing her arm. How could you? How could you speak to your father that way? Do you want him to disown you? Do you want to bring more shame to this family?
The nurse gently removed her mother's hand from her arm. I spoke the truth, Mother. That is not shameful. Filled with tears. You don't understand. This is not how we survive. We survive by being quiet. Change.
I understand, Mother, the nurse said softly. That is how you survived.
There is another way, and I cannot pretend otherwise. Her mother looked at her as though she were a stranger, which perhaps
she was. Then you must leave, her mother whispered, before your father disowns you formally, before this becomes a scandal that destroys us all.
Go where?
わからないよ。東京へ違うを見つけなさい。あなたと同じ会を持つ人を見つけなさい。しかしね、あなたはここにいてはならないな。あの発言の悪ではな。
The nurse nodded slowly, understanding that this was not cruelty but a kind of desperate love. At night, she packed her small bundle. Her mother slipped her some money, saved from years of careful economy, pressing it into her hands with trembling.
Fingers. This is all I can give you, she whispered. Be careful. Be safe.
Come home.
The nurse left before dawn, walking through empty streets toward the train station.
Heading to work in the rebuilding effort. Women queuing for rations, children playing in the rubble, life continuing despite everything that had been lost. At just
the station, she found other women, also alone, also traveling. Some were widows seeking work, could no longer contain them. On the crowded train to Tokyo, she sat squeezed between a woman with 2 small children and an elderly man who slept standing up, swaying with the train's motion. As the landscape rolled past, she thought about what lay ahead. A place to live. No family support. But she had something more fundamental. A truth she could no longer as less than she was. Perhaps that would be enough. Tokyo was overwhelming.
Rubble, yet somehow still functioning. Makeshift shelters crowded between ruins. Markets springing up in bombed-out lots.
Those who had seen too much to be shocked anymore. She spent her first night in a shelter run by a religious organization, sleeping
on a mat on the floor among dozens of other displaced women. In the morning, she began looking for work. Her nursing training opened some doors, though many hospitals had been destroyed and the few that remained were overwhelmed. After 3 days of searching, she found a position at a small clinic serving the poorest residents of a bombed-out neighborhood. The pay was minimal, barely enough for food and a corner in a boarding house she shared with 3 other women. But it was hers. She had earned it. She supported herself. The resources inadequate. But there was something profoundly satisfying about it. She was using her skills. She was fully herself. One afternoon, about 2 months after arriving in Tokyo, she encountered someone from the ship. The neighborhood. Their eyes met across the crowded street, and both women's faces broke into smiles of recognition and relief. To embrace her. I hoped I might find you. They found a tea stall, one of the hundreds that had sprung up in the ruins, and sat exchanging stories. The teacher had also left her family. She had found work teaching at a school for war orphans, children who had. No one left to teach them traditional submission. There are others, the teacher said quietly, from the ship, from the camp, women who saw what we saw and cannot unsee it. We've been finding each other, not organizing, nothing formal. Each other. The nurse felt a surge of emotion so strong it threatened to overwhelm her. They began meeting regularly. A dozen women at first, then 2 dozen, gathering in different homes and shelters. Not activists in any formal sense. They wrote no manifestos, they staged no protests. But they talked. They shared their stories of what they had seen, what they had realized, what they could no longer accept. And slowly, the group became a kind of lifeline, proof that their transformation was. Madness, that another way of being was miscible, even being was possible here. The nurse found herself telling her story.
Rifles, the lieutenant, the sergeant, the pilot. With each telling, the memories became more solid, more real, less like a dream she might have
imagined. And she listened to others tell similar stories. Not all had been prisoners. Some had encountered American women in other ways.
One woman had worked as a translator for the occupation forces and had watched American women negotiating with male officers as equals. Another had seen
photographs in American magazines, images of women doing things she had been taught were impossible. A third had
under occupation, which guaranteed women's equality and suffrage, and had felt something wake inside her. The sources varied, but the impact was the same.
A crack in the wall they had been taught was unbreakable. Through that crack,
light, you cannot pretend the darkness is all there is. At one meeting, late one evening, the factory worker who had worried about her daughter spoke up. I told her, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I told my daughter about the American women, about what women could be.
She listened with her eyes so wide, like I was telling her a fairy tale.
And then she asked me, Mama, could I
be like them? The woman's eyes filled with tears. And yes, you could. If things. Yes. The room fell silent, every woman understanding the magnitude of what had been said.
And that seed might grow into something none of them would live to see fully realized, but which would someday bloom.
The nurse thought of those American women often in the years that followed. Not as saviors or as
that alternative possibilities existed. She never learned their names, those women who had changed her life.
The woman with the rifle had children. If the lieutenant ever wondered about the Japanese prisoners she had processed, if the sergeant training men had.
Any idea of the revolution she had sparked in a prisoner's heart. They had simply lived their lives, done their jobs, existed as themselves.
That had been enough. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if she had never been captured, if she had never been sent to
that compound. She would have returned to her parents' home, married someone suitable, lived a life of quiet.
Would have taught her daughters to be small and quiet. She would have died never knowing there had been any other way. The thought filled her
with equal parts horror and gratitude. Captivity had been her liberation.
Anyway, she could have anticipated. The small group continued to meet through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Their numbers grew slowly, as word spread quietly through networks of teachers, nurses, factory workers, women who had glimpsed something different. Formal organization that might draw attention from authorities still uncomfortable with women's independence. Instead, they were children, working in clinics where they treated women with respect and listened to their complaints as legitimate. Writing small articles in sections, women's magazines that subtly questioned traditional assumptions. Forming reading groups that discussed translated individual conversations, small moments of changed minds. But it was something.
Japan, where war had destroyed so many traditional structures and occupation had imposed new laws guaranteeing women's legal equality. She lived alone in a small apartment, worked at her clinic, and spent her evenings with her group, or reading, or simply sitting in her own space, answerable to no one.
It was not the life she had been raised to want, but it was entirely hers. Her parents never forgave her.
In the last years of her mother's life, the nurse attempted reconciliation, visiting the house where she had grown up. Her mother received her
coldly, serving tea with formal politeness that underscored rather than bridged the distance between them.
A performance of normalcy that fooled no one.
You will find your way back to propriety, that you will marry, even now, that you will become the daughter I raised. Nurse nodded, understanding that this was as close to love as her mother could now offer. I am your daughter, she said gently, just not.
The one you tried to make me. Her mother closed the door without responding. They never spoke again.
Later, the nurse was not informed until after the funeral. Her father, she learned through a cousin, had forbidden her name.
To be mentioned at the service. She grieved, but not for the relationship as it had been.
Existed had her mother been able to see her as fully human. The years passed. Japan recovered, rebuilt, and transformed. Women's lives changed. Slowly but measurably, education rates rose, employment opportunities expanded, legal protections strengthened.
Step. But the direction was unmistakable. The nurse, now in her 40s and then her 50s.
The younger generation would have opportunities she had not. But also a strange melancholy, watching young women take
her so much. Sometimes she wanted to stop him on the street and say, "Do you know? Do you understand what came before?"
What it took to get here. But she never did. Perhaps it was enough that they could live in ignorance of the battles fought on.
Their behalf. Perhaps that was victory, after all. A world where the extraordinary became so ordinary.
8. A young woman came to the clinic where the nurse still worked. She was a university student, writing a thesis on women who had been prisoners of war. She had heard rumors about a group of former POWs who had lived differently after the war, who had never married,
who had chosen independence. Could I interview you?
The nurse looked at this young woman, born into a world that had already changed, who
could pursue university education without question, who could imagine a career without apology, who lived in the world the nurse had.
Helped to create. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, I will tell you. They spoke for hours. The nurse told her story, starting with that. First morning in the compound, the woman with the rifle. She spoke about what it had meant to see women occupying space with
authority, making decisions, giving orders, being obeyed. She described the cognitive dissonance, the slow dawning realization that everything she had been taught was
a lie.
The student listened with increasing fascination. But why don't more people know about this? She asked.
Why isn't this story told? The nurse smiled sadly. Because it complicates the narrative. The story of the war men, about combat.
Stories are treated as footnotes, and stories about women having their worldviews fundamentally challenged.
That for themselves? Those stories threaten too much. They suggest that women's traditional roles are not natural or...
Change is possible, and those are dangerous ideas for those invested in keeping things as they are. The student nodded slowly, understanding.
So your thesis will be dangerous too, then?
The student smiled. I hope so.
They talked until the clinic closed, and then they
moved to a small restaurant and continued talking over tea and rice. The student wanted to know everything. About the other women in the group. About how they had found each other. About what they had done in the decades since.
I can introduce you to some of them,
the nurse offered. Though not all will want to speak. Some still fear judgment. Some have kept their past completely hidden.
From even their children. But some, yes, some will talk. The student's thesis was eventually published. It caused a minor stir in academic circles, though.
It never reached a wide audience. The stories it contained remained obscure, known only to specialists.
Documented. Available for those who would someday look for them. The nurse died in...
Unremarkable. A small obituary in the local paper. A funeral attended by colleagues from the clinic and a handful of women from the old group. No.
Family. No children. Just the chosen family she had built from the wreckage of war and the transformation it had sparked. At the funeral.
The teacher, now elderly herself, spoke briefly. She lived as she chose, she said.
It was revolutionary. That she lived at all on her own terms was an act of resistance. She changed the world, not through grand gestures, but
through the quiet insistence of living differently. And that, perhaps, what they were mourning. Not just a person, but a link to a specific moment of transformation, to a time when they
had all seen something impossible become real. They were aging now, these women. In another decade or two,
with them would go the living memory of that time. But perhaps that was all right. Perhaps the point was never to be remembered.
Leaving military service to become wives, mothers, teachers, nurses in civilian life. Some continued to work.
But to create the conditions where memory became unnecessary. where what had once been revolutionary became so ordinary it required no commemoration.
The American women who had unknowingly sparked this transformation never knew what they had done. That the independence they had tasted in the military was harder to maintain in peacetime.
That existence, brief as it was, had proven something to women half a world away.
Leaving military service to become wives, mothers, teachers, nurses in civilian life. Some continued to work.
Of such moments, small encounters that ripple outward in ways no one could predict. A woman with a rifle, simply doing her
job. A lieutenant processing paperwork. A sergeant training recruits. None of them trying to change the world or prove a political point.
Just living, just existing in their own authority.
Always through grand declarations or violent upheaval, but through the accumulation of small defiances, quiet refusals, and the stubborn insistence on living otherwise.
The Japanese women who had seen American women soldiers never forgot what they had witnessed. Even those who never spoke of it publicly carried
The knowledge with them. They made choices, large and small, based on what they had learned. They raised daughters differently. They demanded better treatment from doctors.
They spoke up in meetings when they might have remained silent. They pursued careers when they might have married.
Multiplied across thousands of women, those small choices accumulated into something larger, into a different world.
Arrived. Japanese women were doctors, lawyers, politicians, engineers. They were CEOs and judges and professors. Not in
resistance, but undeniably present. The world the Caucasian male nurse had helped to imagine had
Completely, but undeniably. And though few knew the full story of how that world had been built, held. Somewhere in a university archive, a thesis gathered dust. In it, preserved in the impossible become real. Most would never read it, but it existed. A record. Leaders or laws, but with ordinary people seeing something different and refusing to unsee it. The story of the Japanese women POWs who
encountered American women soldiers is not widely known. It appears in few history books. It is commemorated by no
mattered. Because every time someone is shown that the world can be different, that the rules can be broken, that structures presented as natural are actually constructed, something shifts, a possibility opens, and possibilities, once seen, cannot be enters. Of those brief encounters in a dusty POW compound in 1945. Not in the grand sweep of history. It's set in motion. Changes that accumulated and compounded. Home with them, and they planted it, quietly, without fanfare, in the small corners of their lives. And from those small plantings came
growth. Slow, often imperceptible, but real. And that growth continues still, in ways
it came from. The seeds planted by women who saw something impossible become real and